All right. It's hard to believe that this is the 25th lesson on Paul that we've had. Okay? It blows my mind. And I was talking to Alan yesterday, and he says, well, are you going to go through withdrawal symptoms once you're through with Paul? Because I've kind of lived with him for almost a year now. And I can definitely say, no, I won't go through the withdrawal because I'm still reading books. In fact, I started a book this week, and I'm almost finished with it on the life of Paul. I think Paul is one of our most significant people that we can study so we can learn about us. And so, when I started this lesson series back in July now, that's kind of hard to believe, back in July, I named it Paul Drawing from the Right Source, knowing that there'd be a day when I could finally explain what the title Drawing from the Right Source is. Today's it. 25 lessons in, you're finally going to get to understand what Paul Drawing from the Right Source means. And I'm very excited about talking about this lesson because unlike some of the other lessons that we've done where you're going verse by verse kind of thing, and that's okay to go verse by verse. There's sometimes when you've got to go by concept. And so you skip a lot of verses because you just kind of go, well, that doesn't go with the concept. So we kind of need to understand this concept. And so I'm going to do a lot of explaining before we even get to the scriptures today. And the reason why is most everybody that I know of really doesn't understand this concept, which is back in Paul's day there was a government. And this government functioned in a certain way. And the reason why you have to understand how that government functions was so that you can go, oh, that's why Paul, that's what happened to him. That's what he had to go through. So, if you really want to understand about God's will and what God does for you in your life and what God can do, you have to understand God is in control of the situation. You aren't. God has a plan for you, and He will, by hook or crook, get that plan through to you. It's just one of those things. You can be as stubborn as you want, but when God gets a hold of you, you're going to feel it, and you're going to know it. And for the past 2 months, we've been talking about Paul going, I've got to go to Jerusalem. I've got to go to Jerusalem. And all these people are going around saying, stop, don't go, don't go. It's terrible, something's going to happen. And you know what Paul said? I've got to go. I have to go. So, what did God do in his stay? First of all, God booked him a room in the city jail. What better way can you be protected sometimes? Is when God places you in jail to protect you from other people. God put him there to protect him. Because you have to understand, last week, he came up and said, I've got to talk to you about my life, so I'm going to tell you my spiritual benchmarks. The people in Jerusalem didn't like it. In fact, they wanted to scourge him. Now, do you understand what scourge means, really?
Scourge means whip someone with the whip.
Yes, but it's worse.
It's worse.
It's worse because you know why? I read a book about it this week. I know a little bit more about the scourging thing now. In Paul's day, when they said that they were going to scourge you, they totally stripped you down to nothing. They put an arm up here, arm here up there, and they just threw whatever they wanted to and whipped you with whatever they wanted to whip you with. And guess what? After they whipped you, they didn't clean you up. They didn't go, oh, it's okay, Vicky, we're going to take you to the hospital. They just let you suffer. Because their major intention of being scourged was you were going to die. And they wanted you to be as painful, in such pain as possible. God delivered Paul from being scourged, and they put him in jail instead. Now, for the rest of Paul's life, you've got to understand that important concept. Paul stayed in jail for a long time. And it wasn't because God was mad at him. God was trying to protect him from other people that wanted to kill him. And you got to think about this too. When Paul gets put in jail, do you know what they did to him? They put a little shekel around their ankle with this ball so that they couldn't run off. And then they put a guard to stand by you so you couldn't run away. Now think about that just for a second. If I'm Paul and I've got someone standing right by me for years, guess what happens to that guard? They get a lot of hearing about God. And most of Paul's jailers, or the people that had to stand guard by him, were eventually saved. You cannot go and hear day by day about what God has done for somebody else without it affecting you personally. And that's the best part about this Jerusalem stay. He gets put in jail. Never thought about it, but God put him in jail. Not only on that, God supplied a temporary means for his safety. That's what he did. He protected him so that he could live and do what God wanted him to do. And like I said about this jailer and about these centurion guards who stand by, God provided opportunities for him to share his testimony. Remember last week we talked about the testimony of his conversion. He talked about the stoning of Stephen. He talked about being baptized. He talked about this. He would share those stories over and over and over because he never stopped sharing them. Yes. And his best testimonies happened when he was in jail. Because if y'all were here back in, I don't know, September or something, the Philippian jailer was a wonderful testimony. And you got to understand, sometimes God does place you in those circumstances. And I like this statement. The reason why he's put there is that Paul was falsely accused of bringing a Gentile inside the temple. Anybody who's not a Jew. You're a Gentile. I'm a Gentile. Anybody in this room is a Gentile unless you're a Jew. And at that time period, and this is why I have to do a lot of explaining. It's like the I Love Lucy show. I got a lot of explaining to do. I have to explain a lot so you can understand why that is such a major statement. That he was accused of taking somebody who wasn't a Jew into the temple because that was strictly forbidden. Because in Paul's day, there was one court that was in charge of all the land, but there were two different factions. Now, does everybody understand what a faction is?
Party.
It's like a political party, okay? Or a group of people that believes a certain way. In Paul's day, there was one court that reigned, and there were two different groups that was in that court. So let's talk about them. The first of them was called the Sanhedrin. The name of that great court was called the Sanhedrin. Every town in Paul's day had a Sanhedrin court. Okay? And that's what everybody lived by. They lived by that Sanhedrin court. The great Sanhedrin was a supreme religious court. In other words, there was one major supreme court that ruled and reigned, and they made a lot of decisions. So what other things can we say about it? That every town in Israel had a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin met in the temple every day, except for Sabbaths, which are what? Sabbath day when they would worship God, which is on their Saturdays, and every time that they had a festival. These people came to the temple every day and decided things. How would you like to be on that court? That means you didn't work. You just came to go to the temple every day and decide things. It's a lot of power. Because the people sacrificed The people gave things to the temple so that you could sit there and do your job. And each Sanhedrin, and I love these terms, that's why I wanted to give you as much history about this so that when you hear the word Sanhedrin, you'll kind of go, oh, I understand, it's the great political system. There was one in each land. There was one that ruled and reigned. Each Sanhedrin was led by a Nazi. It almost looks like Nazi. And when you listen to it on the internet, it sounds like they're saying Nazi, but it's Nazi. It was led by the Nazi, which is the supreme ruler, and then Abed-Din, or the father of the court. There were two major people, the Nazi and the Abed-Din. And both of those people you did not want to make angry. And in the case that we're going to study today, Paul made them both mad. And you're going to find out what happens when you make the Nazi and the Abed-Din mad. They kind of make your life miserable. What else about the Sanhedrin? And I like this. The other men would sit in a semicircle. You would have the Nazi and the Abed-Din, and then you have all these people over here, and all these people over here, and they would face each other. Guess how many people there were? Just guess it. More than 20.
23.
More than 23.
50.
More than 50.
100?
71. There were 71 that sat on this great Sanhedrin.
Okay, the Great Sanhedrin, and then each
Town had a...
Sanhedrin,
Uh-huh.
and there's the Great Sanhedrin.
That's right.
Okay. And where was the Great Sanhedrin?
In Jerusalem.
Okay.
The other ones would be in every town. But there would be this great political party, and they would sit on one side. And you're going to find out they sat according to how they believed. And when we talk about, that's why I have to do a lot of explaining, because he's going to the Great Sanhedrin, and you're going to have to understand, this is what happens when you go to this court. The Sanhedrin was the final authority on the Jewish law, and if an individual did not agree with the Sanhedrin, they were called Zakim Mamri, or a rebellious elder. If you did not agree with what they ruled on your life, you were considered rebellious. And you know what rebellion means? Bye-bye. Yeah, you're going to die, basically. And they decided it. Not anybody else. This Great Sanhedrin. So let's talk about the two political parties here. And these two political parties, I go, man, I wish I would have had time to read a book about both of these. Because there's a lot of interesting things about these. The first one were the Pharisees. Have you heard that term before? Who was a Pharisee that you know about? Paul? Barnabas? Okay, so this is the stuff that you need to know about Pharisees. First of all, it was a political party. Being a Pharisee had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with political affiliation. And it was a school of thought. And what was that school of thought? Membership included working class and poor people. That is the major issue that you're going to come into when you go to the Great Sanhedrin. The Pharisees were not wealthy people.
Didn't Paul, wasn't he wealthy though, because he went
It never says he's wealthy. Huh?
Didn't you say it was expensive?
It was expensive to go to school to become a leader in the church. That had nothing to do with political.
Okay.
But the parents had to raise a lot of money, but Paul's dad was a tent maker. They're not wealthy people. Does that make sense? It kind of blows your mind when you think these Pharisees who ruled and reigned, they weren't very wealthy people. It was just a group of political people who said, from the working class, said, hey, I want to be on this council. How do you get on there? In Paul's day, you bribed your way to it. And how did you get to be the Nazi and the Abed-Din? You bribed more people. It had nothing to do with religion. And that's something you have to understand about the Pharisees. Pharisees is a school of thought. It's how people believe. And yes, they did go to school to become leaders in the temples. It's just a part of it, okay? You can be a Pharisee without being a temple leader. Does that make sense? Okay. It emphasized oral traditions and rites. So in other words, if Dale told me on Tuesdays I must eat chicken, and I go, well, Dale, where did you hear that from? Well, my grandfather told me that I had to eat chicken on Tuesdays. Well, that's an oral tradition. So I would eat chicken on Tuesdays. I would never know why. Do you see some of the dangers with going with just an oral tradition? Not only that, if Dale said, okay, on Fridays you have to send him a check for $50 every Friday, and you go, well, why? Well, my grandfather said that's what he had to do. So we've had to do these all these years. A lot of people never understood what the oral traditions and rites were. They just did them because we did them. Can you think of any oral American traditions that we do today and we really don't know why we do them? Valentine's Day. Halloween. We have a lot of days that we just celebrate. We really don't know why. And sometimes if we did, we'd go, do we really want to celebrate those? Oh, but yeah, it's kind of fun. You know, that kind of thing. So it's all this. And here's the thing you have to understand about this, and this is where the religious situation of the Pharisees came in. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed once you died, there'd become a time when you could be resurrected to go somewhere. And we're not going to go into all the different places you could go, okay? Because that's not the most important thing, is which place. But they believed in heavenly beings. What is a heavenly being? Angels. So they believed in the resurrection. They believed in angels. You always have to remember that because they, throughout the Bible, they get in knockdown, drag-out fights over that one statement right there. And they believed in an afterlife. They believed that there was a place that you could go after you died. That's why, and I'm sorry I have to do all this explaining, but you really have to understand this to go, oh, that's why these people got mad. Sadducees. I love talking about Sadducees. Because they were always sad, you see. That's how I can always remember them. They were not a happy group of people. Number one, they were mostly priests and wealthy people. So you have the working class and the poor, Pharisees, the aristocrats, the wealthy people, were Sadducees. They emphasized strict interpretation of the written law. Now let's think about that for a second. The Pharisees believed in the oral law. The aristocrats believed in the written law. Why would they believe it that way?
The oral law might change occasionally. The rules would change.
Well,
Customs would change. But the written word would never change.
and the poor people probably couldn't read.
There you go. That's the basic tenet. Most of the poor people couldn't read. You know, and they had to rely upon that oral tradition. Versus the Sadducees, they could read quite fluently. And they were saying, oh, so in other words, if you were a Sadducee and the law said you cannot wear black on Wednesdays, you couldn't wear it. And you would be punished for it. You couldn't smile on Thursdays. You couldn't do that either. Pharisees would go, I don't know where that came from, but we've always smiled on Thursdays, so we'll just go ahead and do it. Do you see where the problem would come in?
And then
Well, yes, very good thought. They rejected the resurrection of the dead. They said once you died, you died. You're dead. Is that a problem? Yeah. That's a definite problem. They did not believe in an afterlife. They did not believe in an afterlife. In fact, what these Sadducees said, and I'm trying to find this, but did not believe in an afterlife since the subject was not mentioned in the Torah. The Torah was the first 5 books of the Bible, and since Moses never talked about going anywhere after you died, they said, well, if it's not in the first 5 books, we don't believe it. Now, how would you like to be in a political party or in a room with those two types of people?
It would be interesting.
It would be fun, wouldn't it? Guess who's not even mentioned in either side? Jesus, or relationship with God. It's following the first 5 books, but it's not having a relationship with the person who influenced the first 5 books. So, here we go. We're going to go to the first trial now. We understand what the Great Sanhedrin were. We understand that there were Pharisees and Sadducees in here, and all of a sudden, Paul's put in jail, and he's taken to the Great Sanhedrin, and that's found on page 253 in the New Testament. Page 253, and it is Acts 23, 1 through 3.
253页第23章1到3节。保罗定情看着公会的人说：“弟兄们，我在神面前行事为人，都是凭着良心，直到今日。”大祭司亚拿尼亚就吩咐旁边站着的人打他的嘴。保罗对他说：“你这粉饰的墙，谁要打你？你坐堂为的是按律法审问我，你竟违背律法，吩咐人打我吗？”
Anybody want to make any comments before I start on that? Can you see any problems with verses 1 through 3? Alright, well I'll tell you all about the problems. How's that? The major one thing that had stirred up the Pharisees and Sadducees is, the first thing he said is, I have had a good conscience. Pharisees and Sadducees did not believe in having a good conscience. They believed you had to make sacrifices. Paul comes in and says, I have lived a good life, my conscience is okay. The leader of the Sanhedrin goes, go slap that man, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The leader tells to go slap Paul. You know what Paul's automatic response was?
You hypocrite.
You hypocrite, you need to stop what you're doing. And they said, do you not know the person who said that was the leader of the Sanhedrin? He went, oh, my bad. Because Paul still respected authority. Sometimes have you ever said things you went, oh, I can't believe I said that? It came out. And that's what happened in verse 3. Paul was slapped for his impertinence, for his rebellion. I love that word, impertinence. He was slapped because of what he said. And some of us should be slapped for what we say sometimes. But in this case, Paul did not realize that the leader of the Sanhedrin was the one that said, you should be. And I like this. The term whitewashed wall, this is an old term, okay? Don't have time to go explain it all, but all it just means is you're a hypocrite. That's all it means.
Means you look good on the outside, but what's inside is bad.
Right. And that's the easiest way to explain it. Paul called people for what they really were. And Paul apologizes for his disobedience because he was breaking Jewish law. And that's something we have to understand. Even though Paul was this great leader of the church, and he had made 3 missionary journeys, he had seen all these people converted to Christ, and seen all these churches grow up, he was still respectful of the traditions. Paul did not want to break the traditions. He wanted to follow them as much as they didn't oppose what God had told him to do. So, I like this. Lily, if I slapped you, and your dad just happens to be President of the United States. Why? Because it's a good example. Okay. And your dad's the President of the United States. Don't you think I might get in trouble for doing that? Yeah, okay. Because of all this situation, God says, well, I'm going to have to do something to help Paul out. Because you have to understand, God told Paul in scriptures before this that he was going to go where? What big city? He was going to go to Rome. Is Jerusalem Rome? No. So God's plan for Paul was not over yet. So God had to provide some security for Paul when he needed it the most. And so let's look at verses 10 and 11 for what kind of security that God provided. And to me, I was astounded. Here I am, one person, I'm in jail, but now I've told the leader he's a hypocrite. Okay, I need to be protected. And now let's look and see what God does for him.
第10节，那时大起争吵，先夫长恐怕保罗被他们扯碎了，就吩咐兵丁下去，把他从众人当中抢出来，带进营楼里去。当夜，主站在保罗旁边说：“放心吧，你怎样在耶路撒冷为我做见证，也必怎样在罗马为我做见证。”
Sometimes when we feel the lowest in our lives, God is going to provide something for us to make us feel good. They're called warm fuzzies. Okay? That's what I call them. They are like me coming over, I'm getting inside of the bubble. They're going, it's okay, Sheila. I'm right there with you. And God does that. God provides it. And verses 10 and 11 provides that little intimate relationship that Paul had with God. And God said, it's okay, because what does he do? He says, Paul, take courage. I'm not through here. I still have a plan for you. And for people who are saved and are following what God wants them to do, God's not going to be through with them till he's through with them. They can be 125 years old and still be going, if that's what God wants them to do. And in this case, he says, it's okay. I have a plan for you, and it's not over yet. You're going to testify everything that you know in Rome. And according to tradition and no verifiable evidence, Paul went other places besides Rome, and we'll talk about those other places too. But God was not through with what he wanted Paul to do. God provides the security we need. Believe it or not, God protects me every day of my life. Every time I go somewhere, God's protecting me. And I could share lots of stories with you and tell you what God has done for me in my life and how he's protected. But he's always there. If you are a child of God, God's always there. And here's his answer. And this is the answer for God protecting us and loving us. And it's found in verse 16 and also in verse 35. So we're going to look at those two verses, verse 16 and verse 35.
254页第16节，保罗的外甥听见他们设下埋伏，就来到营楼里告诉保罗。35第35节，255页上面就说，等告你的人来到，我要细听你的事，便吩咐人把他看守在西律的衙门里。
Okay? How did God protect Paul in those two verses? We say a person that's never been mentioned before.
He put someone in the area to be able to hear a lot that was close to Paul.
God does that for us. He will always provide an answer for us. He will have somebody. And notice, in this case, in verse 16, who was it? His nephew. Have we ever heard of Paul's nephew until now? No. And according to a lot of things that I've read this week, Paul's family basically disowned him after he accepted Jesus and was going out preaching. And then all of a sudden he comes to Jerusalem, and a lot of biblical historians believe that the mention of Paul's nephew here was a reconciliation of the family. Which heebie-jeebies.